Okay, so today we're diving into... So it's like we're trying to corner the skeptic, not with evidence from the world, but with the very structure of their own thought.
Exactly. It's kind of it's an ambitious move.
Right.
Trying to deliver a knockout blow to skepticism without getting stuck in that endless back and forth about evidence and justification.
Right, and for us as philosophers, I think the initial appeal is pretty clear. It's like, oh man, maybe we can sidestep that whole regress problem.
Avoid that infinite chain of reasons, yeah.
Yeah, but like our sources make clear, and especially the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry is really good on this. The journey of transcendental arguments has been, well, let's say, bumpy.
It hasn't been smooth sailing, that's for sure.
Yeah, the original grand aspirations have definitely faced a lot of scrutiny, and I think there's been a real shift towards reassessing what these arguments can actually achieve.
A kind of recalibration, yeah.
Mm.
But what I think is really cool about these arguments, especially for a philosophical audience, is how flexible they are.
Oh, definitely.
So yeah, we often associate them with epistemology, right?
Mm.
The whole nature and limits of knowledge. But I mean, you find these transcendental arguments popping up all over the place, like in ethics. How do we ground morality? In the philosophy of mind, what's the nature of consciousness? Even in perception, how do our senses connect us to the world?
It's like this framework can be applied to so many different philosophical puzzles. Okay, so let's trace this idea back to its roots. I mean, any philosopher listening knows we can't talk about transcendental arguments without talking about Immanuel Kant.
Right. Kant is the big name here.
Yeah, and I mean, I know he didn't always use the exact phrase transcendental argument in the way we use it now.
No, not exactly.
But his whole deal with transcendental deductions and expositions and proofs and the critique of pure reason, that's really foundational. So for you, what are the key Kantian moves that set the stage for this whole approach?
Well, for a philosopher, I think the heart of Kant's project is about uncovering the a priori conditions. The conditions that have to be in place for experience to even be possible.
Like the preconditions, right?
Exactly, the preconditions. Like take the transcendental deduction of the categories, for example.
Right, classic Kant.
Yeah, classic Kant. So he's basically asking, how is it even possible for our understanding, with its concepts, to apply to the world we experience through our senses?
To that sensory manifold.
Yeah, that crazy jumble of sensations. Right. And his answer is that these categories, these fundamental concepts like substance and causality, they're not derived from experience. They're necessary for us to have any coherent experience at all.
It's like they're the lens through which we make sense of the world.
Exactly, the lens. And then you have the second analogy. Hume really raised some serious doubts about causality, but Kant says no, the objective succession of events, the way things happen in a certain order in the world, that presupposes a rule, a law, a causal connection.
Okay, so we've got the categories, we've got causality. Now there's another big one that's going to be particularly interesting for anyone who, really wants to dive deep into the potential and also the problems of transcendental arguments.
Oh yeah, the refutation of idealism. This one's a classic.
This out-attempt really highlights how ambitious this is. It's like a direct attempt to shut down those Cartesian doubts about whether the external world even exists.
Yeah, like trying to refute the whole, I think, therefore I am, but maybe there's no world beyond my mind thing.
Exactly. So how does Kant even begin to tackle this?
Well, his move is kind of brilliant, really. He starts with something the idealist already accepts.
Yeah.
The idea that we're aware of our own mental states, our thoughts and feelings, as having a temporal order, like one thought comes before another and so on.
We experience them in time.
Yes, exactly. But then, and this is the crucial part, he says that to be aware of this temporal succession, to even notice that our thoughts have an order in time, we have to also be aware of something permanent, something that exists outside of that flow of inner states.
So there's got to be something stable, something unchanging that provides the background for that temporal order.
That's the idea.
But okay, why can't that permanent thing be something internal? Like Descartes might say, it's the self, the I, that persists through time.
Right, that's a good question. And this is where Kant brings in Hume's critique of the idea of a substantial self.
Right, Hume's famous bundle of perceptions.
Yeah, Kant agrees that we don't have this direct introspective access to a permanent, unchanging self.
It's not something we just find within ourselves.
Exactly. And he also says that this permanent thing can't just be the stream of our representations themselves, our thoughts and perceptions, because those are always changing, they're transient. So Kant argues the only possibility left is that we're aware of something permanent outside of us in the external world.
So external object, the things we perceive around us.
Exactly. And that means that outer experience, experiencing the world outside of ourselves, is actually a precondition for inner experience. It's necessary for us to even have the kind of temporal awareness that the idealist is relying on.
Wow, so it's like a complete reversal. He's saying that to even doubt the external world, you have to already presuppose it.
That's the move.
But for a philosopher really digging into this, the immediate question is, okay, how does this all fit with Kant's own transcendental idealism? Does this refutation really stand on its own 2 feet?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, the SFP definitely points out that there's a lot of debate about this.
Like, does proving the necessity of external objects somehow undermine the idea that these objects are ultimately appearances, phenomena structured by our minds? And how does all of this square with the whole thing about a priori forms of intuition?
Right. There are a lot of layers to unpack here.
Okay, so moving on from Kant, another philosopher who is really important for bringing transcendental arguments into the, let's say, more analytic tradition was P.F. Strawson.
Yeah, Strawson. Especially with his books Individuals and The Bounds of Sense.
For those of us trained in analytic philosophy, Strawson's work often feels a bit more immediately understandable.
Maybe a bit less obscure. Yeah.
So Strawson was clearly influenced by Kant, but he was also critical of some of Kant's ideas, like the reliance on transcendental psychology.
Right. Strawson thought we should ground these necessary truths more in the structure of our conceptual scheme.
Like the basic framework we use to think about the world.
Yeah. And one of his key arguments that's super relevant for any philosopher thinking about metaphysics and epistemology is his objectivity argument in The Bounds of Sense.
So for anyone listening who might not be familiar with this, what's the gist of Strawson's argument for why there have to be objective, mind-independent things?
Okay, so Strawson starts with something that seems pretty basic, that we have self-consciousness. The ability to think about our own experiences and recognize them as belonging to us.
We can say, I am having these experiences.
Right, exactly. But then, and this is where it gets interesting, he says that to think of these experiences as our own, to even have that I perspective, requires us to think of them as experiences.
Like as things that are happening to me.
Yeah, and that means there has to be a difference between how things are and how they seem to us.
This is that crucial distinction between is and seems.
Right. So, the table might seem green to me under this light, but it actually is brown. And Strawson's point is that we can only make sense of this distinction, this possibility of error or illusion, if we have experience of objects that exist independently of us.
So without that external anchor, our experiences would just be this stream of subjective stuff, and we wouldn't be able to tell what's really true about the world.
Exactly. So for Strawson, the existence of these mind-independent objects, it's not optional. It's a necessary condition for having self-conscious experience in the first place.
Kind of like Kant, then. He's arguing from something about our subjective experience, our ability to be self-aware, to a necessary condition in the world outside of us.
Yeah, there's a definite parallel there.
And as philosophers, I think we can appreciate the elegance of that move,
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful argument.
This SP also mentions Strawson's work in Individuals, where he focuses on this idea that unperceived objects, things we're not currently looking at or thinking about, are actually necessary for us to have a coherent picture of the world as a spatio-temporal system.
Yeah, so in Individuals, he's basically saying that our concept of a shared world where things exist in space and time and have these enduring identities, that concept requires things to keep existing even when we're not looking at them.
Otherwise, it would be like the world just pops in and out of existence whenever we close our eyes.
Exactly. And for a philosopher thinking about ontology, this is a big deal. It's like the very framework we use to understand reality already has these commitments built into it.
Yeah.
And the skeptic, they're trying to deny those commitments, but Strawson is saying they're doing it at the cost of making their own view incoherent.
Okay, so there was this real flourishing of interest in transcendental arguments around this time. Even folks like Rorty were giving Wittgensteinian ideas a transcendental spin.
Right, it was a hot topic.
But then came the critics. And one of the most influential critiques came from Barry Stroud in 1968. This paper really shaped the conversation. So for you, what was the central point of Stroud's critique?
Well, Stroud's work basically challenged the whole idea that transcendental arguments could actually defeat skepticism. The ambitious goal of showing that skepticism is just wrong.
He wasn't buying it.
No. He said, look, even if we grant that we have to believe or take for granted that something is true, like there's an external world, that doesn't mean it actually is true.
So he's pointing out this gap, right, between what we believe or experience and what's actually the case.
Yeah, that's the bridge of necessity problem.
And this is a huge hurdle for anyone trying to build a transcendental argument, because if we can't get from our beliefs and experiences to the way the world really is, then the whole project seems to crumble.
Right. Stroud was basically saying, look, we might be able to find necessary connections within our own thoughts and experiences, but it's a lot harder to show that those connections extend outward to the world itself.
The skeptic can always say, well, maybe that's just how it seems to you.
Exactly. And this led to Stroud's famous dilemma for transcendental arguments.
Okay, so for everyone listening, what are the two horns of this dilemma?
Well, Stroud said that to avoid skepticism, the person making a transcendental argument has to either embrace some kind of verificationism or idealism.
So either the world is just our beliefs, or there's no way to really get outside of our beliefs to see what the world is like.
Yeah. And the problem is, if you go the verificationist route, then the transcendental argument seems kind of pointless, right? Because the world is just whatever we can verify, so there's nothing to argue for. But if you avoid verificationism, then the skeptic can always say, well, your necessary conditions, they just apply to your beliefs and experiences, not to reality itself.
So it's a lose-lose situation.
Pretty much.
And the essay goes on to show how Stroud's critique can be applied to all the big names we've talked about. Like with Kant's refutation, Stroud might say, look, all you've shown is that we have to experience the world as if there are external objects, not that those objects actually exist.
Right, that's a classic Stroud move.
And with Putnam's brain in a vat argument, which tries to show that the whole skeptical scenario is self-refuting, Stroud would probably say, well, maybe our words could still have meaning even in a completely different scenario.
Maybe our concepts don't have those external connections you're assuming.
And then there's Davidson's triangulation argument, which says that to have thoughts, we need to be interacting with other minds in a shared world. Stroud might say, well, maybe those others don't have to be real thinking beings, or maybe the world doesn't have to be fully objective.
Right, he's always pushing us to consider those weaker possibilities.
So Stroud's critique really forces us to think carefully about what kind of necessity we're claiming in these transcendental arguments, and whether it really bridges the gap to an independent reality.
Absolutely, it's a major challenge.
But there's also this interesting counterpoint to Stroud that the SEPI brings up. He seems to accept that there can be necessary connections within our thoughts and experiences. So for a philosopher listening, why might that be a problem for Stroud's own view?
Well, the problem is that he doesn't really explain why those internal connections are somehow immune to skepticism, while the connections between our minds and the world aren't.
It's like he's giving special status to the inner realm.
Right. If the skeptic can doubt our knowledge of external facts, why can't they also doubt our knowledge of the necessary relations between our own thoughts? It seems kind of arbitrary.
And even if we say, okay, the modal claims in the argument are solid, X really is necessary for Y, there's still another problem the SEPI points out.
What's that?
The skeptic can still question how we arrived at those modal claims in the first place. Like, how do we know that X is necessary for Y?
Right. If the skeptic doesn't trust our senses and our reasoning when it comes to empirical knowledge, why should they suddenly trust our philosophical intuitions about necessity?
Our minds could be messing with us in all sorts of ways.
Exactly.
And the SEPI even suggests that maybe we're thinking about transcendental arguments in the wrong way. Maybe they're not purely deductive, like a strict logical proof. What if they're better understood as abductive arguments?
That's an interesting idea.
So instead of trying to logically derive the conclusion from some undeniable premises, maybe they're more like inferences to the best explanation.
So the idea would be that the conclusion, like there's an external world, is the best way to make sense of some feature of our experience that even the skeptic accepts.
But then that raises the question of whether transcendental arguments can still be considered, a special kind of philosophical argument.
Right, because if they're just another form of inference to the best explanation, then they're subject to the same limitations and uncertainties as any other abductive argument.
Okay, so given all of these objections, it's no surprise that the philosophical landscape shifted toward what the Esky calls modest transcendental arguments. So for you, what are the hallmarks of this more toned-down approach?
Well, the main idea is to scale back the ambition. Instead of trying to completely defeat radical skepticism, modest transcendental arguments often aim to show something weaker, but still philosophically important.
Like maybe the skeptical doubts are unintelligible, or that they can't really be put into practice, or that they go against some basic commitments we have to have as thinkers.
Right. Those are all good examples.
And the SEP outlines several different modest strategies. So one is to reinterpret Strawson's early work as offering a more alenctic response to skepticism. For those of you familiar with ancient philosophy, you'll recognize this term.
Yeah, this goes back to Socrates.
So how does the strategy work?
An alenctic argument, it's basically trying to refute a position by showing that it leads to contradictions.
It's like you're trapping the other person in their own logic.
Exactly. So with transcendental arguments, the idea is that the skeptic, in the very act of doubting some fundamental belief, they might actually be relying on the same framework that those doubts are supposed to undermine.
It's like a performative contradiction.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't to prove that the skeptic is wrong about the world, but to show that their skepticism is self-defeating in a practical or conceptual way.
They can't even formulate the doubt without contradicting themselves.
Right.
The SEP also talks about Strawson's later naturalistic response. So how is that different?
Well, in his later work, like Skepticism and Naturalism, Strawson argued that these radical skeptical doubts, they're ultimately idle.
They don't go anywhere.
Yeah, because they can't actually dislodge the basic beliefs that are like ingrained in our nature and our ways of thinking.
They're too fundamental.
Right. So in this view, transcendental arguments can help us identify those core commitments, but not as a proof of their truth, more like a description of the structure of our thought.
So it's less about refuting the skeptic and more about understanding the limits of what we can genuinely doubt.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The SEP also discusses Stroud's own more modest position.
Oh, interesting. So even the big critic has a modest take on this.
Yeah, so despite all his criticisms of the ambitious versions of transcendental arguments, Stroud does say that showing certain beliefs to be indispensable and invulnerable, meaning we can't give them up without also giving up believing anything at all, that does have some anti-skeptical weight.
So it doesn't prove that the belief is true, but it does show that it's very hard to get rid of.
Right. And then there's Stern's approach, which emphasizes that different kinds of skepticism might need different kinds of responses.
Makes sense. Like, not all skepticism is created equal.
So for you, how do modest transcendental arguments fit into that picture?
Well, Stern says that modest arguments can be really useful against less extreme forms of skepticism. Like, skepticism that demands justification for our beliefs, but doesn't necessarily say that knowledge is impossible.
So maybe the skeptic just wants to know why we should believe certain things.
Right. And in those cases, a modest transcendental argument might show that a belief is rooted in the very structure of our thinking or our social practices. Like, take the belief in other minds, for example. A modest argument might show that this belief isn't just a random analogy, but it's tied to the way we understand ourselves as social beings.
Okay, so these modest approaches seem to get around some of Stroud's big objections. But I think for philosophers, they also raise questions about how effective they really are against a really determined skeptic.
Yeah, I mean, are we just mapping out the boundaries of our own conceptual scheme? Or are we actually discovering something true about reality itself? That's a big question.
Okay, so this brings us to the connection between transcendental arguments and the fields of modal metaphysics and epistemology.
Oh yeah, these are crucial.
So transcendental arguments often rely on claims about necessity, right? Like X is necessary for Y, but then that means our whole understanding of modality becomes really important.
Right, like what does it even mean for something to be necessary?
Exactly. And as the SEP points out, transcendental arguments can be seen as a kind of transcendental explanation. So we're saying that some condition X is metaphysically necessary for something else, Y, to be possible.
So X is like a fundamental requirement for Y to even exist.
Right. But then for everyone thinking about this, what kind of necessity are we talking about? Is it logical necessity, like something that's true by definition? Or is it some deeper kind of necessity, something about the very fabric of reality?
That's the big debate in modal metaphysics.
And philosophers have come up with different accounts, right? There are rationalist approaches that use conceivability and inconceivability as a guide to what's possible and necessary.
So if you can't conceive of something, maybe it's impossible.
And then there are more empiricist approaches that focus on counterfactual scenarios, like what would happen if things were different.
Right. So the SEP talks about all these debates and how they affect the modal claims in transcendental arguments.
But there's a big worry with using conceivability, which the SEP points out.
What's that?
Well, Just because we can't conceive of something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. It might just mean that we're not imaginative enough.
Right, our cognitive limitations could be getting in the way.
So people who defend transcendental arguments need to address that challenge.
Definitely. Some might say that the transcendental claims aren't just about conceivability, or they might offer a more nuanced view of how conceivability can guide us, even if it's not perfect.
The Sessif also mentions essentialist views, which are based on the idea that things have essential properties, and those properties might be relevant to necessity as well.
Right, so if something is essential to a thing, then it has to have that property in every possible world.
So the strength of a transcendental argument often depends on how well grounded its modal claims are. And those claims, they're still being debated in philosophy.
Yeah, it all ties together.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the Sessif also explores how transcendental arguments have been used in ethics.
Oh, interesting. So how do they apply to moral philosophy?
Well, the ethics suggests that ethicists might be more open to these arguments because there's more acceptance of anti-realism in ethics.
That makes sense. If you don't think that moral values are objective, then the problem of bridging the gap between our minds and the world, which is such a big issue in epistemology, it becomes less of a concern.
Right. So in ethics, you tend to see more modest transcendental arguments that are focused on the necessary conditions for moral agency. Like, what does it take to be a moral agent in the first place?
So it's more about understanding ourselves as moral beings rather than trying to prove the existence of objective moral facts.
The essay gives a brief history and then focuses on two contemporary philosophers, Alan Gilworth and Christine Korsgaard.
Those are big names in ethics.
Yeah, so let's zoom in on Korsgaard's argument for the value of humanity. It draws heavily on Kant's ideas.
Okay, so how does Korsgaard argue for this?
Well, she starts with this basic observation that when we make a rational choice, we have to see the thing we're choosing as good or valuable in some way.
Right, like it has to be worth choosing.
But she rejects the idea that this goodness is just out there in the object itself. Instead, she says that things are good because they satisfy our desires or needs.
So the value comes from us, the agents.
Exactly. But then, for you following along, how does this lead to the value of humanity in general?
Well, Korsgaard says that we can only see our desires and needs as reasons to act if we already value ourselves. Like, if we didn't care about our own existence and well-being, why would it matter if something fulfilled our desires?
It wouldn't give us a reason to do anything.
Exactly. So according to Korsgaard, the very act of making a rational choice, it presupposes that we value ourselves, that we see our own humanity as the source of reasons and values.
The SEP uses the example of choosing to eat cake. So I choose the cake because I want it, and that desire gives me a reason to eat it only if I value myself as someone whose desires matter.
Right, the value of the cake depends on the value I place on myself.
But then the SEPCAR also points out some potential problems with this argument. Like, doesn't it lead to self-conceit? And what about the so-called satanic parallel? Couldn't Satan, who presumably values himself, also use this argument to justify his actions?
Those are serious objections.
So how does Korsgaard address these worries?
Well, she offers a second argument that's based on the idea of practical identity.
So the different roles we play in life.
Right. So Korsgaard says that when we act rationally, we do it under some conception of who we are. Like I might act as a parent or a teacher or a citizen. And the reasons and values that are connected to those identities, they only matter to us because we value those identities.
It's like the value flows from the identity to the reasons and values associated with it.
Right. But Korsgaard says that the ultimate capacity that underlies all of our practical identities is our capacity for rational agency, our ability to make choices and act for reasons. And that's what she means by humanity.
Yeah.
So if we value any of our particular identities, then we have to value that underlying capacity for rational agency.
So it's not about valuing our individual selves, but valuing our shared capacity for reason.
Exactly. And that might be the key to avoiding the problems of self-conceit in the satanic parallel. Because it's not about saying I'm special, but about recognizing the value of rational agency itself.
Right, so it's more universal.
The SEP does note that this argument depends on accepting Korsgaard's anti-realism in ethics. But it suggests that this might not be a big deal for a lot of ethicists.
Especially compared to the hurdles you face in epistemology.
Okay, so the last area the SEP covers is the use of transcendental arguments in the philosophy of psychology and perception.
So here the goal is often less about refuting skepticism and more about figuring out the necessary conditions for specific mental phenomena.
Like what has to be true for us to have certain kinds of experiences or mental states.
And for anyone listening who's interested in the philosophy of mind, what are some examples of these arguments?
Well, in the philosophy of psychology, you have arguments like the idea that intentional action, acting for a reason, requires bodily awareness.
So I have to be aware of my body to act intentionally.
Right. Or the idea that if we're going to guide our actions through perception, we have to have some awareness of where our body is in space.
Like, I need to know where my hand is if I want to reach for something.
Yeah. And there are also arguments that say that experiencing our own bodily actions, like feeling ourselves move our arm, requires a specific kind of representation of the body.
So we need to represent our body to ourselves in a certain way.
But the set P brings up a really important challenge here.
What's that?
Well, some of these claims seem to be empirical, meaning they're based on observation and experience. But if that's the case, then can they really be a priori truths?
Right, because a priori truths are supposed to be independent of experience.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating case study that the SEP mentions, the case of Ian Waterman.
Who's that?
He's a man who lost his proprioception, which is the sense of your body's position in space.
So he couldn't feel where his limbs were.
Right. And his case seems to challenge the idea that bodily awareness is absolutely necessary for intentional action. Because even though he couldn't feel his body, he was still able to move and act intentionally, but he had to do it by visually monitoring his limbs.
Wow, so it's like his mind found a workaround.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, and it raises the question of how to reconcile these empirical findings with the claims of transcendental arguments.
Right, because if a transcendental argument says that X is necessary for Y, but then we find a case where Y is happening without X, that seems like a problem.
Yeah, it definitely challenges the argument.
So how do philosophers deal with this?
Well, there's debate about it. Some philosophers say that these transcendental claims are still a priori, but they apply to normal, healthy human beings.
So they're like describing the typical way our minds work.
Right. Others say that these cases show that the claims are actually empirical, not a priori.
So we can't just figure them out through pure thought. We need to look at the world and see how things actually work.
And this connects back to our earlier discussion about modal metaphysics,
Yeah.
How do we figure out what's necessary and possible? Through thought experiments, through empirical observation. It's a big question.
Okay, so in the philosophy of perception, the SEPI mentions arguments about the nature of perceptual experience.
Like, what does it mean to perceive something?
Right, so there are arguments that say perception has to be intentional, meaning it's about something, and that this intentionality requires representational content.
So when I see a tree, my perception represents that tree to me.
And there's debate about whether this representational content has to be conceptual, meaning it involves concepts. And there's also the disjunctive view of perceptual evidence, which says that we have to be able to distinguish between genuine perceptions and illusions or hallucinations.
Right, so there has to be a difference between actually seeing something and just imagining it.
And then there's naive realism, which is making a comeback these days.
Naive realism, that's the view that we directly perceive objects as they are, right?
Yeah, no intermediaries or mental representations.
But the SFP says that even naive realism is getting a transcendental twist.
How so?
Well, some philosophers are saying that naive realism is the only way to explain the phenomenal character of perception.
The what it's likeness of experience.
Right. So they're arguing that the richness and immediacy of our perceptual experience, it can only be explained if we're directly connected to the world.
So they're using a transcendental argument to support naive realism.
That's the idea. And this often involves imagining what our experience would be like if we weren't directly perceiving objects. And they argue that it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't have the same vividness and detail.
So they're appealing to our intuitions about what experience is like.
And the SFP also points out something interesting about the whole category of transcendental argument. It says that it's actually hard to define exactly what counts as one.
Because philosophers have used them in so many different ways.
Right. They've applied them to all sorts of topics. And they've made different claims about what kind of necessities involved and what the implications are.
So it's more like a family resemblance than a strict definition.